Someone says their name. You hear it. You even repeat it quietly in your head. And then it's gone. Not faded, not blurry. Gone. As if it was never stored to begin with. You were present. You were engaged. You were genuinely interested in this person. But the name slipped somewhere unreachable, and now you're quietly hoping no one asks you to introduce them. And if you know that moment, you know how fast it turns into performance. Most people assume this means you weren't really paying attention. That assumption is wrong. People who forget names easily are often the ones paying the most attention, just not to the name. In the moment of introduction, your mind was already somewhere else, reading the room, registering tone, absorbing the feeling of the person before a single word had been processed as fact. You didn't forget them. Your mind went straight past the label and into the person. And what that reveals about how you actually process other human beings, that's not a flaw. It's something else entirely. Stay inside that moment for a second longer, because this is where people usually get it wrong. The introduction happens. The name is spoken clearly. You hear it. For a second, it exists. Just a word, clean and present. And then the conversation moves forward and takes it along. Not somewhere retrievable, just gone. And now you're standing there, fully engaged, genuinely interested, tracking the way they speak, the energy they carry, the slight warmth or hesitation in their expression, while somewhere underneath, a quiet search is already running, looking for something the brain never quite stored. The hope is simple, that the name won't be needed again, that the conversation ends before anyone requires an introduction. It doesn't always work out that way. And when it doesn't, the embarrassment is immediate. Not the sharp kind, the quieter kind, the kind that feels like failing at something that was supposed to be effortless. What makes it stranger is what the moment actually felt like from the inside. It didn't feel like inattention. It felt like the opposite. That's the whole contradiction. You were there, just not in the way people think. There's a conclusion that forms around this pattern, quickly, and you've probably felt it. Not always said aloud, but present in the slight pause, the small shift before someone moves on. The verdict is simple. If you forget someone's name, you weren't really there. You didn't care enough to remember. And because names seem basic, that verdict feels reasonable. Everyone else appears to hold them without effort. The fact that you don't, repeatedly, across years, starts to feel like evidence. Not just of forgetfulness, but of something worse. Maybe I'm careless. Maybe I'm bad with people. Maybe I'm not actually as attentive as I think I am. That's how the shame builds, quietly. And after a while, it stops feeling like a moment. It starts feeling like a fact. But that fact was built on the wrong premise. Because here is what was actually happening. The mind wasn't absent. It was occupied. In the seconds before and during the name being spoken, it was already reading, scanning posture, registering tone, picking up whether this person seemed comfortable or performing comfort, noticing the quality of their attention, processing the social temperature of the room. All of that was happening simultaneously, rapidly, mostly below awareness. Then the name arrived right in the middle of it, and the brain, already running near capacity, made a silent decision. It kept what felt meaningful. It released the label. This is not a memory failure. It's prioritization. The brain decided, without asking permission, that the texture of the person in front of you mattered more than the arbitrary sound attached to them. It was never distraction. It was a different kind of attention. And that difference matters. Because the name didn't stick. But that doesn't mean nothing did. This is where the pattern gets more interesting. People who forget names don't just forget names. They build systems around the forgetting. The strategic use of "hey," the careful construction of sentences that reference the person without ever requiring their name. The internal scan that runs the moment a new person approaches, calculating whether introductions will be needed, rehearsing how to manage it if they are. You know that scan. You've run it hundreds of times. And then, afterward, sometimes, the private ritual. A check of a social profile, a quiet question to a mutual contact, some way of recovering what the brain didn't retain without having to ask directly. Because asking feels like admission, and admission feels like exposure. From the outside, this looks like simple forgetfulness. From the inside, it's ongoing maintenance. Real cognitive work running beneath interactions that are otherwise entirely genuine. Too many tabs left open. The processing continues even when nothing appears to be loading. And that is the part most people never see. Cognitive psychology draws a distinction here that explains more than most people realize. There are two broad ways the brain encodes other people. The first is semantic. Names, facts, labels, the kind of information that can be written down and passed along. The second is experiential. How someone made you feel, what energy they carried, what the interaction left behind after it ended. Most people use both, but not equally. Research suggests that people who consistently struggle with name retention tend to encode the experiential register with unusual depth. Ask them about a conversation from 6 months ago, and they'll often describe it with precision. Not the person's name, but the moment they hesitated before answering something personal, the shift in tone when the subject changed, the feeling underneath the words. They held all of that. The word just didn't come with it. A name is neurologically arbitrary. The presence of a person is not. You didn't forget them. You encoded them differently. And once you see that, something else becomes visible too. People who forget names consistently are often the same people who notice things others miss. The moment someone in the room has gone quiet, the shift in group atmosphere before anyone names it, the change in a conversation's emotional temperature, the almost imperceptible tightening, the topic that moved past something too quickly. That kind of attunement requires bandwidth, a lot of it. And the brain cannot track emotional subtext and store arbitrary labels with equal strength at the same time. Something gets displaced, and it's almost always the name. Not because the name doesn't matter socially, but because it doesn't matter psychologically. That's a different claim, and it changes the meaning of the whole pattern. The attunement and the gap aren't separate things. They're the same thing, seen from two different angles. But that doesn't erase the cost. The social friction is real. The second ask is still awkward. The expression on the other person's face still shifts. And the self-criticism that follows, the private assessment that this should not still be happening, is real even when the premise beneath it isn't. That cost deserves to be held honestly. Because the hardest part was never just forgetting. It was what the forgetting seemed to say about you. The embarrassment has its own texture. Quiet. Persistent, familiar, not the sharp kind that arrives once and fades, the kind that stays long enough to become part of how you see yourself, the feeling of being caught, of failing at something basic, of watching someone's expression shift slightly when you ask again, and knowing exactly what they're probably thinking, even if nothing is said. Most people who forget names have carried that for years without ever examining the premise beneath it. They absorbed the social verdict and treated it as accurate, distracted, careless, not quite fully present. But the shame was built on a measurement, and the measurement was wrong. Name retention does not measure presence. It measures one style of memory and ignores the rest. It's like measuring the depth of a conversation by how long it lasted. Technically simple, psychologically useless. The behavior was never evidence of not caring. In many cases, it was evidence of caring in a way most people never learned to measure. So return to the moment again. Someone says their name. You hear it. You repeat it quietly in your head, and then it's gone. The scene is the same. What sits underneath it is not. The mind that couldn't hold the name wasn't failing. It was already moving, past the label, into the person. Registering the way they held themselves when they spoke, the specific quality of their presence, whether they arrived in the room or waited to see how the room would receive them. All of that was being held. The name slipped because something else had already been picked up. It was never about the label. It was about what your mind chose instead. And that choice, inconvenient, awkward, socially expensive as it can be, reveals something more precise than people usually assume. Not absent attention, not careless attention, selective attention, human attention. The name was gone within seconds. The person never was.